Fluorescent lights hummed against the high ceiling, their glow bouncing off marble floors so clean they looked like water. The air carried a sterile sharpness tinged with the faint, oily perfume of gasoline and machine polish. Every inch of Sullivan's luxury auto garage spoke of wealth and precision. Polished chrome tools lined the walls in neat rows. Spotless uniforms pressed flat against the men wearing them, each mechanic stiff with nerves. Yet at the center of this temple of engineering lay a silent failure, the cherry-red 1969 Mustang Boss for 129. A car so rare and so worshipped in muscle car history that even seasoned collectors would have knelt before it. Now it sat like a dethroned king, hood gaping open, wires and hoses sprawled like veins ripped from its chest, defiance glinting off its paintwork. Jake Sullivan's footsteps cracked against the marble like a metronome wound tight. He cut, a figure of contradictions, youthful, only 28, yet burdened with the weight of an empire. His Italian leather shoes clicked with the same precision that had made him a billionaire. The founder of a tech company that redefined digital security on magazine covers, he was hailed as the boy genius, the golden prodigy who turned lines of code into gold. But here, under the cold lights, he looked less like an empire builder and more like a man possessed, pacing around the Mustang with a fury that made the room hold its breath. 6 months. His voice boomed, the words ricocheting against steel, beams and glass panels. 6 months and 52 of the best men in the world. And not one of you can tell me why this engine won't breathe. His green eyes burned, sharp as broken glass. He stopped, turned sharply, and every mechanic straightened, their crisp uniforms suddenly feeling like shackles. Jake's hand brushed across the hood, the way a priest might touch a relic. He had poured more money into this restoration than some people would see in 10 lifetimes. He had flown specialists across oceans, men whose resumes carried legends, German engineers, Japanese precision masters, even the mechanic who once touched Steve McQueen's private collection. Each one left with the same shame in their eyes. It should run, but it DOES and single quotes T. Marcus Chen, the head mechanic, stepped forward with sweat clinging to his temples despite the cool air. He cleared his throat, his voice cautious. Mr. Sullivan, we've checked everything. The carburetor, the fuel pump, timing chain, electrical system, ignition coil, spark plugs. We've stripped it and rebuilt it twice. By all accounts, this car should run. Jake's laugh was harsh, brittle, the sound of a man cornered by the one thing money couldn't dominate. He turned on Marcus, pacing closer until their reflections stood side by side in the Mustang's polished fender. That explained why it doesn't, he hissed, low enough that the mechanics nearest them shivered. The silence was unbearable. 52 men in spotless uniforms, masters of their craft, reduced to statues under the glare of a billionaire who had never learned to accept failure. The Mustang, once roaring with defiance, now mocked him with its silence. Jake clenched his fists, staring at the still heart of the machine. For a man who had bent markets and governments to his will, who had carved his name into the future before turning 30, the truth cut deeper than the silence of a dead engine. All his power meant nothing in the face of this mechanical riddle, and in that silence, something inside him twisted, a suspicion, a shadowed fear he couldn't admit aloud. Maybe it wasn't the car that was broken. Maybe it was him. Asterisk the December. Wind still clung to Emma's jacket as the glass doors of Sullivan's luxury auto groaned shut behind her. The temperature inside was warmer, but it didn't ease the ache in her bones or the hollowness in her belly. Her small hands gripped the stroller handle tighter, the squeaky wheel echoing far louder than she wished. Tommy whimpered inside, his cries weak from hunger, his face flushed. She leaned down for a moment, whispering, "Just a little longer, baby, I promise," before straightening and pushing forward across the vast marble floor that reflected her patched jeans and scuffed sneakers back at her like a cruel mirror. The men in their crisp uniforms turned one by one, confusion flickering across their faces. They stood in a wide circle around the Mustang, the air thick with their collective failure. When her small voice cut through the tension like a crack in glass, "Excuse me," the sound was so soft it almost drowned under Tommy's growing wails. Jake Sullivan spun sharply, his green eyes flashing like sparks catching steel. His jaw tightened as his gaze landed on the child, no older than 8, standing at the edge of his sanctuary of engines. Behind him, Marcus Chen frowned, already stepping forward as if to sweep her away like dirt from the floor. "Who let a kid in here?" Jake's voice thundered, his tone sharp enough to make half the men in the room flinch. His fury, already simmering, now threatened to boil over. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. But she didn't back down. She squared her shoulders, tightened her grip on the stroller, and met his gaze without blinking. "I can fix your car in 1 minute." The silence that followed was jagged, broken only by Tommy's thin cries. Then a ripple of laughter spread across the garage. One mechanic chuckled, another snorted, and soon 52 grown men were shaking their heads, laughing at the absurdity of it. A little girl, in duct-tape sneakers, claiming what the world's best specialists could not. But Jake didn't laugh. Something in the way her words landed steady, certain. Not like a child playing pretend froze him. He studied her face, the gaunt cheeks, the dark eyes burning with a strange mixture of desperation and confidence. There was no joke there, no bluff, only truth spoken with the simplicity of someone who couldn't afford to lie. "You're joking," he muttered, more to himself than her. "I don't joke about engines," Emma said. Her voice was stronger now, lifted by the rhythm of Tommy's cries. "But I need you to buy formula for my brother first. The expensive kind. Similac Pro Advance. 2 cans. He hasn't had milk since yesterday morning." The laughter died like a candle in the wind. Mechanics exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly reminded that the child wasn't here for games. She was here because she had no choice. Her jeans were patched in 3 places. The sneakers were held together by strips of silver duct tape, and her small hands trembled. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Something in her eyes, something unyielding and sharp, like his own reflection from 20 years ago, stirred an old memory of nights when hunger gnawed at him in a tiny apartment far from marble floors and luxury engines. Marcus stepped forward, his voice clipped. "Sir, this is ridiculous. Should I call security?" Jake lifted his hand, silencing him. His gaze never left the girl. "What's your name?" "Emma Martinez. My mom used to clean your offices." "Sarah Martinez. You fired her last week." Jake blinked, the name cutting deeper than he expected. He remembered Sarah, quiet, hardworking, never late. The memory of signing her termination order flashed through his mind like a stamp of guilt. "And you think you can fix what 52 experts couldn't?" Emma nodded once. "I don't think. I know. But Tommy needs formula and diapers first. Size 3 Huggies and baby food." She paused, her eyes steady as she lifted the blanket back over her brother. "Please." The word wasn't weak. It wasn't begging. It was a condition, spoken by a child who had learned to negotiate not for toys or treats, but for survival. Jake studied her, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Then he pulled out his phone. "Marcus, send someone to buy what she asked for. Best formula, best diapers. Get some baby food too." The mechanics looked at one another, stunned. A billionaire, giving in to the demands of an 8-year-old girl. But Jake wasn't thinking about pride or appearances. He was thinking about the certainty in her voice, the fire in her eyes. "Asterisk, you get 1 shot," he said finally, his tone low, dangerous. "If you're wasting my time." "I'm not," Emma interrupted, adjusting the stroller handle with practiced precision. "Your mechanics are checking everything except the obvious. They're so focused on complex problems they missed something simple, something a kid who's been watching through that window for 3 months would notice." Jake froze. 3 months, every night she'd been there, silently observing, memorizing the rhythm of failure. His heart thudded once, heavy, as he realized this wasn't some child's fantasy. This was a storm he hadn't seen coming. And for the first time in 6 months, the air in the garage shifted, suspense thickened. Something was about to happen that none of them could explain away. Asterisk, the delivery boy hadn't even left the garage when Emma crouched by the stroller, carefully unwrapping the cans of formula and twisting one open with hands far too steady for her age. She mixed the powder into a bottle with the kind of speed and precision that told Jake this wasn't the first time she'd done it on her own. Tommy's cries softened as the warm milk touched his lips, his tiny fists unclenching, his body easing into relief. The entire garage, 52 mechanics in spotless uniforms and 1 billionaire in a suit, worth more than her family had ever seen, stood frozen, watching an 8-year-old feed her brother with a competence none of them could match. When she was sure Tommy was settled, Emma rose. She straightened her patched jacket as though it were armor and walked toward the gleaming Mustang. The laughter that had echoed moments before was gone, replaced by an uneasy murmur. Every step, of her duct tape sneakers on the marble felt louder than the last. As though the entire building held its breath, Marcus Chen moved quickly, stepping between Emma and the car, his face flushed with indignation. "Mr. Sullivan, this is absurd. She's a child. Do you really think letting her lay hands on a boss for 129 is wise? We've had specialists from around the world." Emma didn't flinch. She tilted her head, eyes sharp. "And they all failed, didn't they?" Her words sliced the air like a blade. "If they were right, the car would be running. But it isn't. You're too busy protecting your pride to see the truth." Marcus stiffened, his jaw tightening. His voice rose, the desperation of his wounded ego spilling out. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. I rebuilt this engine myself." Emma stepped closer, so close she had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. Her voice dropped to a calm, steady tone that quieted the entire garage. "If you really rebuilt it, then you should know where you went wrong." The silence was unbearable. Even Jake, pacing behind them, froze. Marcus's mouth opened, then closed, his breath uneven. "Enough," Jake snapped, his patience fraying. His gaze cut through Marcus like glass. "Step aside." Marcus faltered, rage flickering in his eyes. But he obeyed. The circle widened, and Emma stood before the car at last. The Mustang gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its hood open like a wound that had defeated every man in the room. She placed her small hand on the edge of the engine bay, almost reverently, then leaned over. Jake's heart pounded. He didn't know what unnerved him more. That 50-grown men had been brought to their knees by this machine, or that an 8-year-old girl looked at it with the calm certainty of a surgeon preparing to cut. "Wait," his voice broke through the hush, softer now, edged with something he hadn't felt in years, fear of being disappointed. "Before you touch it, tell me what you'll do." Emma glanced back at him, her dark eyes unyielding. "I'll do what none of them bothered to. I'll start with the basics. Engines don't lie. They just need someone who listens." She paused, adjusting the flashlight in her hand, its beam catching the gleam of chrome. "You'll see." The men shifted uneasily, muttering under their breath. One of them scoffed, "This is madness." Another whispered, "What if she scratches it?" But no one dared laugh again. The weight of the moment pressed down on them like steel. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, his pulse racing, against every instinct screaming at him to stop this. He stepped closer to the car and nodded once. "Go on. You get one chance." Emma leaned in, her small fingers tracing the lines of the engine, pausing at the distributor cap, moving with deliberate care. She murmured things to herself, half whispers of numbers and sequences, words that meant nothing to most in the room, but sounded alarmingly precise. The tension grew unbearable. Every flick of her wrist, every breath she took seemed to pull the air tighter. Jake's chest ached from it. His empire, his pride, his fury, all of it hung in the balance of a child's steady hands. And when she finally looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, she said for words that hit harder than any mechanic's explanation had in 6 months, "You wired it wrong." Gasps erupted, Marcus paling instantly. The weight of her accusation landed like thunder. Jake's eyes narrowed, something hot and electric twisting in his gut. For the first time, the billionaire who could bend governments and markets felt utterly powerless, waiting on the verdict of an 8-year-old girl with duct tape sneakers. Asterisk. The garage was so silent that the faint drip of condensation from an overhead pipe sounded like a drumbeat. 52 mechanics, men whose hands had built engines that sold for fortunes, now stood like schoolboys awaiting judgment. Marcus Chen's face burned crimson as Emma's words echoed off the steel beams above them. "You wired it wrong." Emma didn't wait for permission. She leaned deeper into the engine bay, her flashlight cutting through the shadows, her small fingers moving with precision. The beam landed on the distributor cap. She twisted it slightly, humming under her breath, her lips moving with words that sounded too sharp, too technical for a child her age. Jake Sullivan, watching every movement, felt his pulse quicken. She didn't fumble, didn't hesitate. She moved like someone who had memorized the anatomy of this beast long before she ever touched it. "Here." She pointed to a vacuum line snaking near the carburetor. Her voice was steady, almost casual, as though she wasn't aware she was dismantling the pride of 50-grown men. "This is connected to ported vacuum. It needs manifold vacuum. That's why your timing is off." Marcus stepped forward, spluttering. "That's impossible. I checked those connections myself." Emma shot him a look that cut him mid-sentence. "Then you checked wrong." A nervous ripple spread through the crowd. Mechanics shifted their weight, some scowling, others pulling out phones. Fingers already flying across screens as if searching for terms she'd used. Manifold vacuum, ported vacuum, words that sounded like a foreign language in the mouth of a child who barely came up to their shoulders. She moved again, tracing spark plug wires like she was following a trail only she could see. Her fingers stopped at 2 wires near the back, and here's your bigger mistake. Cylinders 3 and 7 are swapped. It'll never idle right like that. Jake felt the words slam into his chest. He turned his gaze toward Marcus, who looked stricken, frozen between disbelief and humiliation. Check it, Jake ordered, his voice low, sharp. Marcus hesitated. Pride battled with reality in his face. Slowly, reluctantly, he leaned over, tracing the wires with trembling hands, and then his color drained. He looked up, eyes wide, lips pale. She's right. A low murmur rose among the men, disbelief turning into awe. Some shook their heads, muttering curses under their breath. Others stared at Emma as though she were an apparition. Emma wiped her hands on her jeans, leaving streaks of grease across the faded denim. Then she straightened, the flashlight still in her grip like a soldier's weapon. Fix those 2 things, she said, her voice calm, unshaken. And it'll run. For a moment, no one moved. Then Jake stepped forward. His expression was unreadable as he looked down at her, then at the car that had mocked him for half a year. Without a word, he slipped into the leather driver's seat. The silence pressed harder now, like the weight of a collapsing roof. Jake's hand hovered over the ignition, every eye in the garage fixed on him. His empire, his reputation, his fury, all of it funneled into this one moment. He turned the key. The engine coughed once, then again, stronger, and then, like a beast awakened from a long and bitter sleep, the Mustang roared to life. The deep growl filled the garage, reverberating off the marble, shaking tools on the walls. It wasn't just noise, it was victory, fury, history all at once. The sound of 6 months of failure being obliterated in 60 seconds. Mechanics staggered back, jaws slack. Some clapped without realizing it, their palms colliding in disbelief. Others simply stood, staring at the child who had done what they could not. Jake sat frozen in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. For months, he had cursed this car. For months, it had taunted him. And now, fixed by a girl no older than 9, it purred under his touch like a satisfied predator. He turned the key again, cutting the engine, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Slowly, he rose from the seat, stepping out into the stunned circle. His shoes clicked once against the marble, then stopped. He stared at Emma, who was bent over the stroller, tucking Tommy's blanket more securely around him, as if the roar of the Mustang hadn't just shattered the arrogance of 52 men. For the first time in years, Jake Sullivan found himself speechless. The billionaire who had commanded boardrooms, crushed competitors, and bought silence with money, now stood powerless before a child who had asked for nothing but formula and diapers. Wait, he whispered, his voice raw, breaking. Through the silence, Emma didn't look back. Tommy needs his nap, she said softly, adjusting the bottle at his side. The formula will hold him for a few hours. Jake's jaw tightened. Something twisted deep inside him, shame, awe, regret. Something he couldn't name. For 6 months, 52 men had given him excuses. In less than 1 minute, an 8-year-old girl had given him the truth. And he wasn't sure which stung more, that she had fixed the car, or that she had exposed him. The roar of the Mustang still lingered in the air like thunder long after. A storm had passed, but the silence that followed was heavier than steel. 52 mechanics stood rooted to the spot, their uniforms immaculate, but their faces stripped of certainty. The impossible had just happened, not by their hands, not by the world-renowned specialists they had flown in from across oceans, but by an 8-year-old girl in patched jeans and duct-tape sneakers. Emma adjusted the blanket over Tommy's small body, her hands steady, her dark eyes guarded. To her, the applause, the murmurs, the stunned faces didn't matter. Tommy had milk. He was quiet now, and that was the only victory that counted. Jake Sullivan could barely breathe. His hands still tingled from the ignition key, the sound of the engine replaying in his chest. It wasn't just the fact that she had solved the riddle that crushed his empire of mechanics. It was the way she had done it. No hesitation, no boasting, just the clarity of someone who had lived her life depending on simple truths. Where? His voice faltered, something it never did in boardrooms or press conferences. He swallowed and tried again. Where did you learn that? Emma looked up, her gaze calm, unreadable. The library, she said simply, books on engines, YouTube videos on the library computer, and 3 months of standing outside your window, watching your men make the same mistakes over and over. A ripple of shock spread through the room. Marcus Chen's throat worked as he tried to find words, but none came. Several mechanics glanced toward the glass window she spoke of, as if suddenly seeing themselves through her eyes-grown men fumbling while a hungry child memorized their errors from the cold outside. Jake's stomach tightened. His pride, his anger, his rage at the Mustang, all of it began to shift into something heavier. He remembered Sarah Martinez, always quiet, always professional, her uniform pressed even when her eyes looked tired. He remembered signing the termination papers, the report that she had taken leftover food from the executive kitchen. A sandwich tray, bowed for the trash. Policy had been clear. Theft was theft. He hadn't thought twice, until now. My mom, Emma's voice was steady, but her knuckles whitened against the stroller handle. She's been crying since. You fired her. She only took food because we hadn't eaten. She didn't want us to go hungry, but you called it stealing. Her words landed like stones against glass, each one shattering the silence further. Jake felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. For the first time in years, shame slid under his skin. He looked around the room, at the men who would not meet his gaze, at the car that mocked him less than this little girl did. He had always told himself he was fair, decisive, efficient. But now, staring at Emma, he realized he had been cruel without even knowing it. Marcus tried to recover ground, his pride bleeding into his tone. This doesn't prove anything. It could have been luck. Anyone can. Emma's head snapped toward him, her eyes blazing. Luck, she repeated, the word sharp as a blade. That car has a 429 cubic inch V8 with semi-hemispherical combustion chambers. The vacuum advance needs 12 to 14 degrees at idle for manifold vacuum. If you connect it to ported vacuum, you get nothing. It retards the timing and makes the engine stumble. And when you swap the wires on cylinders 3 and 7, the whole firing order collapses. That's not luck. That's knowing how engines breathe. The room fell dead silent. Even the mechanics who had mocked her now stared, wide-eyed, as if she had ripped their textbooks open in front of them. A few reached for their phones again, desperate to confirm what she said. But Jake already knew the truth. She was right. Every word. His chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years. Helplessness. He was a man who had built $1 billion empire from nothing, who had stared down investors and regulators without blinking. But here he stood, undone by an 8-year-old certainty and a truth he could no longer deny. Emma turned back to Tommy, adjusting the bottle, her voice quiet now, almost gentle. Engines don't lie. People do. Pride does. But machines, they always tell the truth if you know how to listen. The weight of her words settled over Jake like a verdict. For 6 months, 52 men had chased shadows. He had chased anger, money, and obsession. But this child had listened, and in her listening, she had exposed more than their mistakes. She had exposed him. For the first time since he had built his empire, Jake Sullivan felt small. Smaller than the girl with duct tape sneakers. Smaller than the baby in the stroller who now slept in peace, and deep inside, a thought he couldn't shake whispered like a curse. What else have I been blind to see? Asterisk, the garage still smelled of gasoline and victory, but the silence had taken on a different weight, no longer just disbelief, but something more dangerous. Respect. Uneasy, reluctant, humiliating respect. 52 mechanics, men who had spent their lives building reputations, now stood in the presence of a child who had undone them with nothing more than observation, knowledge, and hunger. Jake Sullivan remained still, the roar of the Mustang still vibrating through his bones, his mind whirling. He had spent 6 months obsessed, pouring endless money and energy into this problem, convinced it was a test of his will, his intellect, his dominance over failure. But tonight, under these cold lights, his empire had been dismantled not by the car, but by an 8-year-old girl who should have been home asleep, not bargaining for formula in exchange for fixing what his men could not. Marcus Chen tried again, his pride bleeding into his words, his voice brittle. Mr. Sullivan, this can't stand. You can't let her show us up like this. It undermines what? Jake's voice cracked like a whip, sharper than the roar of the Mustang had been. He turned slowly, his green eyes flashing like emeralds struck by fire. Your pride, your reputation, you had 6 months. 6 months, she had 3 minutes. Marcus faltered, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Jake's anger wasn't directed at him anymore. It was directed inward, burning through the armor of his ego. He had built his empire on precision, on always being the smartest man in the room. Tonight, he had been the blindest state. Emma adjusted Tommy's bottle again, as if none of the tension mattered to her. She didn't seem interested in their applause or their shame. To her, the Mustang was just another machine. Her brother's full stomach was the only victory that counted. That indifference struck Jake harder than the roar of the car. She wasn't dazzled by him, by his wealth, by his authority. She had stood before his empire and demanded nothing but food for her brother. For the first time in years, Jake felt something foreign press against his ribs, humility. He turned back to Marcus. Get my assistant on the phone. Marcus blinked. Sir, asterisk now. Jake's voice was low, controlled, but every syllable carried the finality of a gavel. The head mechanic hesitated, clearly rattled. What should I tell her? Jake's gaze flicked to Emma. She was sitting now, crouched by the stroller, smoothing Tommy's blanket, her face lit by the faint glow of a security light from above. She looked small, impossibly fragile, yet her presence dominated the room, more than all 52 men combined. Tell her to prepare a consultant contract, Jake said. The words crashed over the room like a wave. Mechanics gasped, murmuring among themselves, some shaking their heads violently. Marcus looked stricken, his lips parting in disbelief. Hey, a contract for her? She's a child. Jake stepped forward until he was nose to nose with Marcus. She did what you couldn't. What none of you could. Age doesn't matter. Results do. His voice dropped, almost a growl. And in case you've forgotten, I don't reward failure. I reward brilliance. And right now, she's the only one in this room who's earned it. The murmurs rose again, disbelief colliding with awe. But Emma didn't even lift her head. She stroked Tommy's hair softly, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up at Jake, her eyes were calm, steady. I don't care about your contracts, she said quietly. I care about my mom. Will you give her job back? Or are we just a problem you'll forget tomorrow? The question cut deeper than the engine ever had. Jake froze, the words lodging in his chest. He thought about Sarah Martinez, walking out of his offices with her head bowed, carrying the weight of humiliation he had signed into being. He had dismissed her life with a signature. But here was her daughter, standing before him, brilliant and unyielding, forcing him to face the cost of his decisions. His throat tightened, pride wrestled with guilt, wealth with conscience. The easy answer would be to wave a hand, to buy silence, to bury this moment under money as he had done so many times before. But looking at Emma, he realized money was the one thing she didn't value. Yes, he said finally, his voice lower, stripped of arrogance. Your mother will have her job back. He hesitated, then added, and more. She'll never have to worry about food again. Emma studied him for a long moment, searching his face. For the first time since she'd walked into the garage, her shoulders eased, if only slightly. She turned back to Tommy, brushing a thumb across his cheek. Jake exhaled, the weight of his own words settling over him. He didn't know yet if he had spoken them out of guilt, admiration, or something deeper, but he knew one thing with certainty. He could never look at his empire the same way again. The Mustang purred behind them, alive again. But Jake understood now the real engine that had been repaired tonight wasn't under that hood. It was in him, and it had taken an 8-year-old girl to start it. The garage lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow on chrome and marble. But the air felt charged, alive, as if the Mustang's roar had electrified every wall. Jake Sullivan stood at the center of it all, his chest still heaving, his empire shaking in ways no stock market crash could have ever managed. Around him, the circle of mechanics whispered and shifted, each man struggling to reconcile the humiliation of their failure with the miracle they had just witnessed. Emma Martinez, her sneakers frayed, her jacket too thin for December, crouched by the stroller, adjusting Tommy's blanket as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The child's breath was soft now, steady, milk-drunk, and peaceful. She didn't bask in triumph, didn't demand recognition, didn't even glance at the billionaire whose world she had just turned upside down. She was only concerned with her brother. That indifference struck Jake harder than the roar of his. "Beloved Mustang, your mother will have her job back," Jake had already promised. But even as he said it, the words felt too small. This wasn't about a job. It wasn't about food or diapers, or even a Mustang that purred again after 6 months of silence. It was about something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. He turned slowly, facing the stunned crowd. His voice rang out, hard and unshakable. "Listen to me, every single one of you, tonight." An 8-year-old child walked into this garage and did what 52 of you could not. She solved the puzzle. She listened when you refused to. She saw what you overlooked. His green eyes burned as he swept them across the men. "If you're embarrassed, good. You should be. Let it drive you. Because brilliance doesn't care about age, or title, or pride. It speaks through truth." And tonight, truth came from her. The men shifted uneasily, some flushing red, others bowing their heads. None dared interrupt. Jake turned back to Emma, who was now standing again, one hand resting on the stroller handle. "Emma Martinez," he said, his tone shifting. Softer now, but no less commanding. "I'm offering you more than a contract. I'm offering you recognition. From this day forward, you're not just Sarah Martinez's daughter. You are a junior consultant for Sullivan Automotive. Your ideas, your observations, they will be heard." The words hit the room like a hammer. Gasps erupted, murmurs flew. Some of the mechanics outright shook their heads in disbelief. "This is madness," one whispered. "She's a child," another muttered under his breath. Emma's dark eyes flicked up to Jake. She didn't look impressed. She didn't look overwhelmed. She looked wary, guarded. "I don't care about your titles," she said softly. "I care about my mom. I care about Tommy. Will you really make sure we're okay? Or is this just another promise that disappears tomorrow?" Her words cut deeper than any applause could have soothed. Jake felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had built an empire on deals, contracts, and promises sealed in ink. But in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that this little girl, standing in patched jeans with oil smudge on her cheek, didn't believe in him. Not yet. And for the first time in his life, Jake Sullivan realized he wanted someone's trust more than their money. He took a breath, his voice steady when he spoke again. "No, Emma, this isn't a promise that vanishes. Your mother will be reinstated, but not as a cleaner. She will manage operations for this facility. No more scrubbing floors. She's earned better. And so have you. Your family will have an apartment, safe, warm, and your education." He paused, his jaw tightening as if sealing his own fate. "Your education will be funded by me. College, beyond. Whatever you dream of, it will be yours." The garage erupted in noise shock, disbelief, outrage from some, awe from others. But through the clamor, Jake never broke eye contact with Emma. Her lips parted, her expression faltering for the first time. She blinked, almost as if holding back tears she refused to let fall. Then she whispered, "Why?" Jake's chest tightened. He thought about his own childhood, about hunger that had gnawed at him in silence, about promises no one had ever made to him, much less kept. He thought about Sarah, dismissed for taking food that would have been thrown away, and about the car that had mocked him for months until a little girl had taught him to listen again. Because sometimes, he said quietly, the smallest hands carry the greatest power, and if I don't honor that, then everything I've built means nothing. For a long moment, Emma simply stared at him, her eyes searching, weighing him. Finally, she nodded once, as though granting him something rarer than applause. Her acceptance. Jake exhaled, the tightness in his chest easing. He turned back to his men, his voice cutting through the air once more. "Take a good look. Remember this night. A billionaire, 52 mechanics, and one little girl who reminded us all that pride is worthless without truth. If any of you think you're too good to learn from her, you're free to leave now." Not one man moved. The Mustang purred again, in the background, alive and powerful, but it was no longer the center of the story. The real engine, the one that had truly roared to life, stood beside her brother's stroller, small hands clutching the handle, a child whose brilliance had rewritten the rules of the night. And as the marble floors reflected their figures, Jake Sullivan knew with absolute certainty that his world had changed forever.